What happened in the Arabian Sea was not a random drone encounter, it was a stress test of modern power. A relatively cheap Iranian drone moved toward one of the most sophisticated naval formations on Earth, and the United States responded exactly the way a superpower is supposed to respond: fast, disciplined, and lethal. A US F-35C shot it down near the USS Abraham Lincoln. No damage, no casualties, tactical success. But if that is where the analysis ends, then the analysis fails, because the drone is not the whole story. The response is not the whole story. The real story is the exchange that took place underneath the visible event. A cheap, expendable platform forced a high-cost defense ecosystem to activate at full seriousness. And in modern conflict, that is not just a failed attack. That is a probe, a measurement, a systems event. This is the part most people miss because they are still watching war the old way. They look for explosions, losses, and dramatic outcomes. They ask who got hit and who walked away. But that lens is no longer enough. In the drone era, the decisive contest is often invisible in the moment. It lives in ratios: cost versus cost, production versus production, adaptation versus adaptation, ambiguity versus certainty, volume versus readiness. That is where the real competition is happening now. And once you start watching those ratios, this incident looks very different. We are living in a world where military spending keeps rising, yet strategic comfort keeps shrinking. More money is being spent. More advanced systems are being deployed, more sensors, more software, more integration, more precision. And yet, cheap drones and missiles continue to create stress for the most expensive and technologically advanced militaries in the world. That is not a contradiction. It is a pattern. The pattern is brutally simple. First, a dominant power builds a platform so effective that it reshapes doctrine, budgets, and strategic thinking. It wins, it deters, it becomes the centerpiece of national confidence. Then it gets optimized, more advanced, more specialized, more expensive, more integrated. It becomes even more capable tactically, but also more dependent on long supply chains, finite magazines, and industrial throughput. Then an adversary stops trying to match it head on and starts attacking the economics around it. Cheap, numerous, expendable systems are used to trigger expensive responses. The weaker side doesn't need to destroy the platform. It only needs to make the defense math ugly. Then comes the inversion. The dominant power begins adapting downward, toward cheaper interceptors, layered unmanned defenses, distributed architectures, revised doctrine, and faster industrial cycles. That adaptation may work, it often does. But the moment it becomes necessary, the old era of effortless superiority is over. This is not theory. This is how military history keeps moving. We saw it in the battleship era. Great powers built capital ships so imposing that they became symbols of national destiny. Those ships concentrated firepower, prestige, and political meaning into a small number of hulls. Admiralties organized around them, budgets revolved around them. Entire strategic cultures were built on the belief that control of these ships meant control of history. And for a time, that was true. Then the cost density increased: bigger guns, more armor, more expense, more concentration of value, fewer ships carrying more national prestige, long replacement times, massive crews, strategic caution. The stronger the platform became, the more painful it became to lose. That is when asymmetric pressure found its opening. Mines, torpedoes, and submarines changed the equation. Suddenly, a navy did not need to win a glorious line of battle engagement to threaten a maritime empire. It could attack shipping, force escorts, disrupt supply lines, impose insurance costs, and create uncertainty. The prestige platform still mattered, but it no longer monopolized strategic outcomes. The image of power remained. The mechanics of power changed. Then the pattern repeated again when air power matured. Battleships were still treated as symbols of naval dominance, even as aircraft began rewriting the geometry of combat. Nations kept upgrading the old prestige platform because institutions always interpret new threats through old frameworks. Bigger ships, thicker armor, larger guns, rational improvements applied to assumptions that were already decaying. Then came the shock. Air-delivered strikes bypassed the old terms of engagement. Range changed, tempo changed, angles of attack changed. The attacker no longer had to fight the battleship on the battleship's preferred terms. Did major powers adapt? Yes. Carriers rose. Radar integration improved. Sortie generation became central. Naval doctrine evolved. But the key point is this: the adaptation only accelerated after the pattern had already exposed the old model's vulnerability. That same mechanism appeared again in land wars, when overwhelming conventional superiority met low-cost, distributed threats. In Iraq and Afghanistan, the United States entered with extraordinary military advantages: air superiority armor, ISR, logistics, precision strike, command, and control. In conventional battle, the dominance was real. But prolonged campaigns created a cost-heavy operating model. Armored convoys, route security, giant bases, contractor layers, Sustainment systems, specialized vehicles, long logistical chains. Effective in many ways, necessary in many ways, but structurally expensive. Then came the IED ecosystem, cheap, modular, adaptable, decentralized. Its goal was not to surpass US. Technology. Its goal was to impose cost, delay, risk, and political strain. One low-cost device could trigger a cascade of responses. Route clearance, jamming, surveillance, armor upgrades, intelligence efforts, engineering teams, new procurement cycles. Every response was rational. Every response increased the bill. The US adapted impressively. MR apps, ISR fusion, better tactics, better intelligence, better protection. But even with successful adaptation, the strategic lesson remained. High-end military superiority does not automatically produce favorable outcomes against low-cost, adaptive systems designed to exploit your operating model. Now bring that same logic back to the Arabian Sea. The American Carrier Strike Group remains one of the most formidable military formations in existence. Nuclear propulsion, integrated air wing, advanced escorts, layered defenses, electronic warfare, command networks, experienced crews, global logistics. It is a real concentration of power, not a symbolic one. It can project force at scale and defend itself across multiple layers. That supremacy is real, but so is the cost structure behind it. Every sortie requires sustainment. Every interceptor loaded into a ship's magazine is finite. Every maintenance cycle depends on industrial capacity. Every escort deployment consumes readiness. Every high-end response uses time, attention, and throughput. Every decision under uncertainty carries cost. This is why a drone incident matters even when the drone never lands a hit. The event forced a decision under uncertainty. Was it surveillance? A decoy? A probe? A test of response timing? A radar mapping attempt? A signaling operation? A low-cost intelligence gathering effort disguised as provocation? In asymmetric competition, ambiguity is not a side effect. It is part of the weapon. The weaker side can afford to be cheap and uncertain. The stronger side is forced to be expensive and certain. That burden is the strategic terrain. And that is why saying the drone was shot down so nothing happened is analytically shallow. Something happened. A low-cost system compelled a premium defense ecosystem to reveal how it responds, what it prioritizes, and what it is willing to spend to preserve certainty. That is information. That is pressure. That is doctrinal stress. That is strategic signaling. In that sense, outsmarted does not mean sank the carrier. It means something more important for the long game. It means the attacker forced the defender to play on expensive terms. This is how eras shift, not usually through a single spectacular breakthrough, but through repeated unfavorable exchanges that accumulate quietly until doctrine and procurement are forced to change. And change is already happening. The United States and its partners are increasingly focused on lower-cost counter-drone options because using top-tier interceptors against every low-cost aerial threat is not a sustainable exchange in a prolonged high-volume environment. That shift is not weakness. It is intelligent adaptation. It is exactly what a serious military should do. But let's be honest about what that shift means. It means the old math is no longer comfortable. It means the challenge is not just tactical interception, but strategic efficiency. It means the system has recognized that future conflict will be measured not only in kill chains, but in cost chains. That recognition is the real headline. Because great powers have a recurring temptation. When confronted with a new threat, they answer by escalating sophistication. More layers, more integration, more exquisite systems, more premium solutions. Sometimes that is absolutely the correct response. But if every challenge is answered with a high-cost solution, the adversary learns a dangerous lesson. I do not need to defeat your best system. I only need to trigger it often enough. That is the logic of attritional pressure in the drone age. Can you stop 10 cheap threats this week? Probably. Can you stop 100 next month across multiple locations? Maybe. Can you sustain that while preserving readiness for another theater, another crisis, another escalation ladder? That is the real question. Can your production lines replace interceptors fast enough? Can your ship magazines stay full under repeated pressure? Can your procurement system iterate at battlefield speed? Can your doctrine evolve before the next wave of adaptations arrives? Can your political system tolerate years of low-grade incidents that each look manageable, but collectively drain resources and confidence? This is where strategic outcomes are increasingly decided, not in the cinematic moment, but in the cumulative exchange. That is why this moment feels unsettling to people who still think power is mainly visual. Visually, a carrier strike group still looks untouchable, and in many scenarios, it is devastatingly superior. But visible dominance and favorable long-term exchange ratios are not the same thing. A system can look invincible while still being economically stressed by cheap, persistent, adaptive pressure. Both things can be true at the same time, for a while, until the hidden ratio starts determining readiness, deployment patterns, and political choices. This is also why technology will save us is only a partial answer. Technology matters enormously. Better electronic warfare, directed energy, autonomous defense layers, lower cost interceptors, smarter sensors, unmanned pickets, faster manufacturing, and more distributed force design could absolutely restore better defense economics. The US may adapt successfully. It has adapted before, but technology does not cancel the pattern. It advances the cycle. Every dominant architecture eventually becomes optimized. Every optimized architecture creates a cost structure. Every visible cost structure becomes a target. Every targetable system invites asymmetric pressure. Then adaptation begins again. That cycle is the reality, not because one country is weak, not because one platform is obsolete, not because one drone changed everything overnight. It matters because the incident reveals the machine underneath modern conflict. And that machine runs on ratios. Cost to launch versus cost to intercept, time to build versus time to replace, quantity versus precision, ambiguity versus certainty, field adaptation versus institutional inertia. Once war becomes a contest of ratios, prestige alone cannot carry the future. So the practical takeaway is not panic, it is clarity. If you are evaluating military power, stop measuring it only by the sophistication of flagship platforms. Measure sustainability. Measure magazine depth. Measure replacement timelines. Measure industrial scalability. Measure doctrinal agility. Measure how efficiently the system absorbs repeated pressure. If you are watching geopolitics, stop asking whether a cheap drone can destroy a superpower in one dramatic strike. Ask whether thousands of cheap systems, used over time by states and proxies, can impose chronic strategic costs faster than the stronger side can adapt. If you are thinking about naval warfare, stop forcing the conversation into the carrier is obsolete versus the carrier is invincible. That binary is lazy. The real question is more demanding and much more useful. Under what conditions can a carrier strike group maintain favorable economics and survivability in a world of persistent low-cost saturation threats? That is the question that actually predicts the next era. And if you want the simplest version of all of this, here it is. The drone was not the event. The ratio was the event. The ratio decides whether superiority can be sustained after months of pressure, not just minutes of contact. The ratio decides whether adaptation happens early or after avoidable losses. The ratio decides whether tactical wins accumulate into strategic stability or mask strategic erosion. So do not get trapped in the shallow argument about whether the drone failed or the warship won. The tactical result is already settled. Now, the deeper contest is still unfolding across the Gulf, the Red Sea, Ukraine, and every battle space where cheap autonomous systems are probing expensive precision defenses every day. This is not the end of American naval power. But it is the end of the illusion that prestige platforms alone guarantee strategic comfort in the drone age. The adaptation race is already underway. The economic race is already underway. The doctrinal race is already underway. And the side that understands the pattern first will not necessarily be the side with the flashiest platform. It will be the side that can hold a favorable exchange ratio under stress, at scale, for longer than everyone else. That is why this incident matters far more than it looks. Because history rarely announces a transition with a giant sign. It whispers through exchange ratios. It hides inside procurement math. It reveals itself in the moment a disposable machine forces a superpower to show how it plans to pay for certainty. And that is the real revelation here. Not that a cheap drone can magically defeat a carrier, but that cheap, repeated adaptive pressure can force even the most powerful military systems into a long war of accounting, where every response must be justified, not just tactically, but economically. Once that happens, the battlefield is no longer just a place of firepower. It becomes a place of balance sheets, production tempos, and adaptation speed. And in that kind of war, the side that wins is not always the one that looks strongest at the start. It is the one that can stay efficient the longest. So if you're watching this and wondering why one drone matters, that's why. It matters because it shows the future arriving in miniature. A small object, a massive response, a clean tactical victory, and underneath it, a strategic question that will define the next decade. Who can afford to keep doing this longer? If you want to understand what happens next, stay with this story, because the next phase is not about isolated incidents. It is about systems learning, industries adapting, and doctrines rewriting themselves under pressure. And the countries that grasp that early will shape the next order, while the ones that rely on prestige alone will discover, too late, that image is not the same thing as endurance.